Hey Matt, thank you so much for taking the time.
Of course.
Um, I read your book called Start at the End, and I was absolutely fascinated how you were able to link behavioral science to business and all that.
Mhm.
How did the book come to be?
It has a little bit of an unusual story. So I left academia early in my career and became the head of product at a startup. And even at the time, I started to do a little bit of press on behalf of the company, and people were sort of intrigued by this idea of using science to build products. And so when you start to do some press, one of the things that happens is a lot of either book agents or book publishers will come and find you and say, "Hey, we think you should write a book." So there were a bunch of people that said, "Hey, you should write a book." And what I discovered was the business model of the book industry is not one that I particularly love. So I'll give the example of Simon and Schuster. Simon and Schuster came to me and they said, "Hey, we'd really love you to write a book." And I said, "Cool, like it'd be interesting to write a book. Here are some things I'd be interested in writing a book about." And then as we went further down the conversation, you know, for them, they really expect authors to sell the book, right? The modern business book is sold by the author. So their idea is, "Hey, Matt's going to go like travel the world and, get on NBC and do all these things and sell the book for us." And so as an example, one of
Hmm.
the things, I don't charge speaking fees. So when I speak, at a conference or something, I don't charge speaking fees. And if there are speaking fees, I ask them to be donated. They were
Right.
like, "We don't want you to do that anymore. Don't speak for free. Only agree to speak if the conference agrees to buy your book. So if they buy, 100, a copy for every attendee, then you'll speak." I don't want to do that. I'm not interested in sort of blackmailing people into buying my book. That's a terrible model. So for years and years and years, I had said no to all of these publishers who essentially felt the same way. And then this publisher came to me and a young editor said, "We'd like you to write a book." And I said, "I've had these terrible experiences with everybody else. I'm not really interested." And she said, "Look, I live in your neighborhood. I know you. I've seen you tweet about this restaurant. Why don't we just have lunch at this restaurant that we both like? And let's see, maybe we'll be different." And sure enough, she said, "Look, we operate that way too, right? We also expect authors to sell the book, but sometimes we feel so compelled by someone's content that, we just want to take a flyer and we want to make sure that they write a book and we want that to be true in the world. And we feel that way about you. And so if you don't want to promote it, you don't have to promote it. You don't have to sell it. You don't have to do anything. All you got to do is write it." And so sure enough, working with her, that's how the book sort of came to be. And that's why it's very much, got cursing in it, right? Like it's got feminist politics, and it has all of these things that business books don't typically have, because they were so kind in saying, "Hey, just do it the way that you want to do it, and we'll take care of everything else." And so that's how the book sort of came to be.
Why do you want to do it that way? Why don't you want to make money off of it?
So it's interesting, the lineage of even though I left academia, I think there are parts of academia that really stick with me. And one of the things that I grapple with is nothing I'm saying is really original, right? Sure, I'm formulating it a different way, and I took these concepts of behavioral science and I put it into a structured process that no one else had sort of drawn out before. But I didn't invent that. That is just a natural way of doing things in the world, right? To me, right? It's based on academic theory about how the mind works. And, so it feels weird to me to say, "Hey, people should pay me for knowing this thing," right? I prefer to be paid for doing things, right? So, if you want me to come in and create some deliverable for you or help you, train your people or those kinds of things, that's a little bit different. But because I'm getting paid for the act that is the teaching. But just the knowledge itself doesn't really feel like something that we should be charging for. And so the book proceeds are donated to scholarships at colleges to help underrepresented people. Like, I just don't feel like knowledge is a thing that I'm interested in charging for. And to be clear, I recognize that's a position of privilege, right? Not everybody's in a position where they can say, "Hey, I can forego this revenue, I can forego this money." I am in a position that I can forego this money, and so I'm going to choose to do that. But it's not an indictment of anybody who makes their money through knowledge. If you make your money through knowledge, God bless you, and keep doing it. But it's just not right for me.
And this knowledge, how did you come into it? Like, what was the story of getting into behavioral science? Because it's kind
Yeah.
of like an odd thing. It's not something a lot of people hear about.
Well, particularly, 20 years ago when I started, it was very unknown. And if it was talked about, it was talked about often in very sort of nonprofit or governmental settings, right? Sort of how do we change policy, or it wasn't necessarily a private business thing. I sort of fell into it. I didn't go into college thinking I was going to be a social psychologist. I sort of fell into it, but I had this really formative experience, which I've talked about many times. I was in a class, in a psych class, and we read a paper, and I felt like the authors were overreaching, right? I didn't argue with their data. It just felt like their conclusion wasn't supported by the data. And so I brought this up with the professor, and he said this wonderful thing to me, a guy named Andrew Ward at Swarthmore, still teaches, fantastic professor. He said, look, the field agrees on this interpretation. So the field has agreed that this data is sufficient to justify this conclusion. But if you disagree, there's an orderly way to respond, because this is science, which is to do your own experiment. And so you can do your own experiment in order to prove that maybe there's something else going on there. And by the way, if you want to do that, you're welcome in my lab, and I will help you run this experiment. I just fell in love with that as a concept, right? I think up to that moment in life, the more articulate or the more, status, people won arguments through argumentation rather than evidence. And it was beautiful to have somebody say, like, actually, here's this field where, evidence can win out, and, we can get to better ideas of right through an evidence-based process. And that just made me, fall back in love with science. I think we all take science in 8th grade and learn the scientific method and learn about hypotheses and evidences and things. And then we sort of forget about it in the, you go through those terrible teenage years where you're focused on everything else and you just forget how beautiful this thing is. And then for me, it was really a rediscovery of how wonderful this thing could be in terms of leveling the playing field. I'm a first generation college kid. I was raised in rural Oregon, and my father used to say, that my brother and I were his chance to change the world, right? He never went to college. He was, sort of a working class guy his whole life. What he sort of said was, hey, like, my ability to change is dependent on my ability to change other people. If I can shape you and your brother, I can then create change through you. And so it got me really interested in the idea that, like, hey, if we can change the behaviors of others, there's this sort of ripple effect, right? I mean, it's like a teach a man to fish kind of problem. If I could teach other people how to do behavioral science, that is going to be my life's work. And so for the last 20 years or so, I've done things to apply it in my own work as I had a product. But really, it's always about, like, how do I get Shen to, like, think about things in a different way? And how does he get other people to think about things in a different way? And then how does that spread, to make us a more science-based egalitarian society?
Then can it be seen as manipulation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a whole chapter in the book on ethics, right? Because for exactly this reason, because, with great power comes great responsibility, or whatever, superhero quote you would like. And I'm careful to sort of say this in class, right? Like, the same things that you do to get people to stop smoking are something that a cigarette company could look at and say, well, here's how we get people to smoke, right? This is one of the things that ultimately made me leave academia was, you put out this scientific finding hoping that it will help people save more money, but, some bad actor uses it to make people spend more money, right? And you don't have any control over it, right? Like, once you understand this basic scientific finding, it can be used in more than one direction in more than one way. And so, I think there are companies that can be manipulative. I think we have to be careful with the word manipulative in terms of what does it actually mean, right? I think if you are getting people to do something that they wouldn't, or that they don't have the basic motivation to do, that's a form of manipulation, right? So, one of the things we recommend in the book is this idea of a behavioral statement, right? When a target audience has a motivation, they will behavior as measured by data, right? Mm-hmm. If they don't have that basic motivation and you're still getting them to do the behavior, that's really problematic. The example I sometimes give is, like, if I write a behavioral statement that says, like, when Shen wants to go from point A to point B, he will take an Uber. And then I interview Shen and I'm like, hey man, why'd you take an Uber? And you said, well, I wanted to flirt with the driver. That's an ethical problem, right? The reason you think you're doing it and the reason I think you're doing it are different. That's a real problem. That's manipulation, right? I've made you do something for reasons other than my intended reason for you to do that thing. And so,
Right.
I absolutely think that it can be manipulation. And I think the best thing that we can do is put in place ethical checks internally and externally to guard against that. I think it's really hard to legislate. It would be hard to sort of say, that the FDA, or the FCC or whoever would come in and say, like, you're manipulating people. It's very hard to prove. But I think we know it when we see it. And I think the best thing we can do is train people to be on guard for their own biases.
So this seems like it's very powerful. And before you said it levels the playing field.
Mm-hmm.
How does it do that? How exactly does it do that?
Well, so you can brute force behavior change. What do I mean by that? Given enough time and enough money, I can just sort of, I can put out, let's pretend I had infinite time and money. And so I could buy up all of the advertising on every channel for everything. I could just run ads 24/7 that targeted every different identity group and were an infinite collection of ads. And now that we have AI, I can just generate infinite AI ads, right, on every channel to get somebody to do something. I don't have to be very targeted that way. The sort of warlike metaphor we often use is if you have a target, right, and you have a machine gun that shoots, a huge amount of bullets, I don't really have to aim. I can just sort of go, it's generally in that direction, and then go, and one of those bullets will hit it. If you only have, if you are in a position of scarcity, you have only a single bullet, you really have to aim. And what science lets you do is aim better, right? It doesn't work very well if you have only one bullet, right? If you really have only one bullet, what you should do is pray, right? You should close your eyes and just fucking pray. It's belief-based. So it's ironic, actually. Right. I come from the startup world, and yet I recommend that really early stage startups don't use science. Why? Because at the very earliest stage of a startup, you just have to go off a belief, right? You don't have enough resources to science anything. You just have to believe hard enough and then try. And if you're wrong, then you shut down and you move on to the next thing, right? That's like having one bullet. If you have one bullet, just have a belief that you can hit the target, fire your bullet, and hope you're right. Let's say you have 10 bullets, right? I've got enough resources. Now I can start to use science, right? I can shoot a bullet, and I can see that it lands to the left of the target, and I can adjust and shoot again, right? And I can say, oh, I understand why it went to the left of the target because of that gust of wind. So I'm going to wait for the wind to die down, and I'm going to shoot, right? And then say, oh, it also shoots to the left even when the wind has died down. Maybe the scope is off, and so I'm going to move the scope by 3. That's science, right? So if you have infinite resources, you can just spray and pray. If you have only one, you have to just, close your eyes and hope. Science is really in that lovely middle bit. And what that does is mean that people who don't have infinite resources, who aren't at giant companies, can hit the target reliably with a lower expenditure of resources. Now, it also implies, Shen, that all of those big companies that are wasting shit tons of resources could stop wasting so many resources. So there's a sort of, even if you had lots of resources, there are better methods than spraying and praying, right? You waste a lot of bullets doing that. So there's, even if we only took big companies and we got them to do behavioral science, you'd still get a greening effect because you waste less resources. And those resources could be human capital. Those resources could be physical and literal resources like ads on a page, right? Could be lots of different things. But there is an egalitarian sort of conservation effect that happens because of science, because you're right. Science is a process for being right reliably. And so I think there's a lot of power in doing that effectively.
So it sounds like the companies that actually use this would be like a little above starting. So they already been in operation for a couple of years, but haven't gotten to the size that they want to be at. And then.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If we look at the practical reality of where the most people employed in the field are, it's at those giant companies because they can afford to have big teams and they can afford to have lots of people.
Yeah.
To your point, where it becomes effective, Yeah, there's some period where belief no longer, you're out of the belief stage. One of the ways that I always, people sometimes say, well, when should I turn on science? When does it become worthwhile? And what I basically say is, in applied science, it's when the cost of change becomes sufficiently high that it makes sense to not waste bullets, right? So when you get to this point where, hey, I have enough resources that, the cost of changing what I'm doing is going to be high because I'm moving in a velocity direction. I don't want to lose velocity by pivoting unless I know that there's a reason to pivot. And so that's the point at which, like, once you're moving at speed, that's when you kind of want to steer. Because, like, it's like driving a car, man. When you're going really slow, it doesn't, you can you can go like this on the steering wheel. It doesn't really matter because you're not moving fast enough that it matters, right? Once you're up to speed, right? There's some speed at which, like, hey, doing this starts to make the car fishtail. That's the time you want to start to use science, right? When the cost of changing is high enough that it might cause your car to fishtail, that's when you want to say, great, I'm going to bring in some science.
How do you use science to do that? Because I read your book and then I watched some videos, but I didn't fully understand it.
Sure.
How do you use science? Because I know you have like the IDP process and the side method. How does that work?
So let's break this down. The side is just a better replacement of IDP, right? We kind of figured out that actually, if you spell it out, strategy, insights, design, and evaluation turn out to spell side. So I accidentally made an acronym. Probably should have called it side to begin with. But that's, you'll learn as you go. Let's step back from that for a second. Every business is really three things, right? There's a business model, a behavioral model, and an operational model. The business model is what things we're going to monetize and how, right? So Netflix monetizes watching via subscription, right? Uber monetizes going somewhere through direct payment, right? Getting in the back of someone's car and they monetize through direct payment. So there's a business model portion of this. That is not my part of the business, right? It's not my job to say how we're going to make money and what behaviors we make money on, right? That's outside of the concerns of behavioral science. That's the behavior bit.
Right.
Similarly, there's an operational bit that I don't concern myself with. How do we do this at scale? Like, I'm not, how do we get 1 million drivers and, have the technology to coordinate where all those points are and all those sorts of, like, all that tech, all that stuff, that's outside of my part too. That's operations. What we need is the behavioral model. It's the middle bit to say, well, I know how I'm going to make money. I'm going to make money by people watching. I know how I can distribute that. I can distribute it via this streaming network thing that I have. How do I get people to watch? Right? That's
right.
Right.
So your part is how to get the customers.
Well, yeah, it could be the customers, could be whoever, right? Sometimes it's employees, but it's the part where I might monetize employees doing a particular behavior, and I'm focused on employees. But it's all about monetizing some behavior that has already been established as valuable. It's not my job to say what behaviors are valuable. It's my job to say, given that the business has decided this behavior is valuable, it's my job to make that behavior occur in a way that someone could scale later, which is the handoff operations.
So for like a plumbing company, for example, you come in and you find a way how to make people want to use them for plumbing more?
Well, so as a plumbing company, my business model is generally direct payment, right? You're going to fee for service. You're going to pay me for a thing that I do for having someone come to your house and fix your plumbing, right? Like there's a behavior that is someone coming to your house and fixing your plumbing.
Right.
I need to figure out how do I get people to, now there's more than one behavior that could be involved in that. It could be, how do I get customers to call, right? How do I get customers to prefer me? It could be, how do I get my plumbers to plumb things faster, right? Like in under 15 minutes or less. How do I, there's all sorts of potential behaviors that affect the monetization model of my business, right? The key point here is, it's not my job to decide what those behaviors are. That's the business's job. It's strategy's job, business's job to say, here are the behaviors we want to change, right? It's my job to accept that. So put differently, Shen, right? If we think about strategy, insights, design, evaluation, right? That's how we think of behavioral science. In strategy, we're writing this behavioral statement, right? when a target audience who has some limitations wants to motivation, they will behavior as measured by data, right? Like that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
We're not actually making that sentence. We're helping the business figure out how to make that sentence, right? We need the business to express what it is success looks like for them. What do you want us to make people do? Not
so that's
how.
like the end goal.
Exactly. What's the end goal? There's a reason the book's called Start at the End, right? It's interesting. I was recently talking about you need to think of it like a genie. Shen, you've seen a movie with a genie, right? And what does every movie with a genie have happen? Well, you say, I want to be able to run fast. I want to be the fastest person on earth. And the genie snaps his fingers and suddenly you have 12 legs, right? And you go, man, I really didn't format that wish very well. That's a lot of business, right? If you don't format your wish well, if you don't spend the time to articulate who's going to be doing what, you'll make wishes like, well, I want to make a lot of money. Cool. I can make you make a lot of money by breaking all of your bones and, having you sue companies for the fact that all your bones are broken, but you're going to be living with a lot of broken bones, right? Like that's probably not your actual outcome, right? So that first step is really about getting people to articulate their wish correctly. That's what we talk about. When we talk about strategy, it's how do I get the business to articulate their outcome in a way that I can consume?
Getting a clear goal. Basically.
Getting a clear goal. That's right. So then we move on to this I, right? So now we've got a strategy. Strategy is where do we want to end up? Then we're moving into the I, the insights. So in order to get where I want to go, I have to understand why would anyone want to be in that world? Why is that an attractive world? And then 2, why aren't people already in that world, right? If it's an attractive world, why don't we already live there? So we call those promoting pressures, things that push us towards that world, and inhibiting pressures, things that push us away from that world. So we use quantitative and qualitative methods. That's really just data science and then user research, right? So talking directly to people and looking at large populations of data to understand the promoting and inhibiting pressures that determine the current balance of behavior. So we do this by looking at 5 key groups. Always, never, sometimes, started, stopped. Shen, what's your favorite sport?
Tennis.
Tennis.
Basketball.
Wait a minute, you just changed mid-thing. Tennis, is it tennis or basketball?
No, basketball.
Basketball. And watching or playing?
Both.
Both. Okay, let's go with playing. So there are people who often play basketball, rarely play basketball, sometimes play basketball, didn't used to play basketball but just started, used to play basketball but just stopped, right? So if you think of a graph, there are people who are like at the bottom, in the middle, at the top, or they're at the bottom, they're at the top, they're going back and forth, or they are going down or up, right? That's every possible line on a graph. I want to compare those. So Shen just started playing basketball. Matt just stopped playing basketball. Why? Maybe Matt just stopped playing basketball because he still loves basketball. Promoting pressures are still very high. But, it turns out to be true that I am going to turn 41 in a couple of days. And, my knees are a little crunchy. And, it's not as fun to play basketball as it once was. So it's not that I love it less, right? It's not a change in promoting pressure. It's a change in inhibiting pressure. My knees hurt. It's not as fun to do. I don't do it anymore, right? Does that make sense?
Right, yeah.
There's another world where Matt says, actually, it's not my knees. Nothing about my body has changed. I just don't really like it as much as I used to. People have gotten really competitive and I don't enjoy it in the way that I used to enjoy it, right? That would be a change in promoting pressure, right? Which is a really big difference. And so I can't know what I need to do in the world. I can't know what I'm supposed to change unless I know whether the problem is a promoting pressure or an inhibiting pressure. So that's why we go compare these groups, right? I start to say, well, Shen does it more than Matt does. Is it because he enjoys it more than Matt does? Or is it because his knees are better than Matt's are, right?
So you can't fix both.
Well, I can fix both, but I got to know what they are first, right? I got to do the research to figure out, why are things the way that they are? It's really hard to change things if you don't know why people are or aren't doing it today. So that's when we say insights, that's really what we mean. We just want to understand why they're doing it or why they aren't doing it today. What's determining their current behavior? Then we can go into design, right? That's the D inside, right? So now we know where we want to go, strategy. We understand why we are where we are, insights. Now we want to go lean on the scales. How do I actually change the state of where I am? And the way to do that is either by strengthening promoting pressures or weakening inhibiting pressures or both, right? In order to get people to do something. So design, the key to design is this. I'm a lying liar, Shen. I don't know if you knew this about me, but I'm a lying liar. What am I lying about? I don't really change behavior, right? I can't pop open Shen's brain and find the do stuff button and hit it. Like play basketball. I can't just find the play basketball part of your brain and then hit it and then you play basketball. That's not what happens. Instead, what I do is rebalance those pressures. So, I give you some knee exercises to help you not hurt so much. And I introduce you to a friend who really likes playing basketball. So I make the inhibiting pressures lower and I increase the promoting pressures. And then that changes your behavior. That gets us to the last thing, that E, right? So we know where we want to go. We know where we are, why we are where we are. We have some ideas about how we might rebalance the pressure, some designs of how we might rebalance the pressure, but I don't know if they work, right? So I have this idea that maybe giving Matt some one of those athletic sleeves that goes around his knees and helps his knees be less crunchy will lower the inhibiting pressure. But until I actually give Matt that and have him try it, I don't know if that will make him play basketball more. So we need this evaluation part where we're actually sort of saying hey, does this work the way I think it's going to work? Right. And that's that E inside. That's that evaluation. And then I've got some evidence that it works and I can pass it off to operations. Right. So I received it from the business in strategy and now I'm giving it to operations post evaluation.
Oh, so you essentially start at the end and then kind of just work your way backwards and you just keep iterating. And then do you get one strategy and then test that one out? Or is it multiple?
It depends. It depends how many resources I have. What I would tell you is on most projects, we're going to run between 3 and 5 pilots. We're going to try 3 to 5 things. And usually there's 1, 2, 3 of those that are worth scaling, right? 1, 2, 3 of those that I can go to operations and say, I have evidence that these sort of work reliably enough that it's worth scaling them out into the business. And again, that's not my job to choose. It's like I'm a cook in the kitchen, man. So I go to the business team and I say, tell me about the kind of food you want to eat. Then I go prepare a few dishes with a little tasting menu. And I say, hey, now which one of these do you actually want me to make, right? Here's a bite of each of them. Which one do you actually want me to make at scale? And that's really their decision. That's an operational and business decision based on the ROI. Let me give you an example. Maybe we find something that affects some of the people all of the time, a little bit, and it doesn't cost very much, right? So those are sort of our variables. What percentage of the population does it affect? What frequency does it affect it, right? Does it affect it some of the time, all the time, never? How big is that effect? It makes them do it a little more or a lot more. And then how much does it cost, right? Those are really the 4 variables I care about. And so what I ideally want to do is come to you, Shen, CEO of the company, and say, hey, I've got some things that work a lot, but only for a few people and only some of the time, and they're pretty expensive. I've got some things that only work a little, but they work all of the time, right, with a larger population, and they're pretty cheap. And you might, for totally valid business reasons, decide to pick one, the other, both, neither, right? That's up to you. My job is to create the menu with a cost and effect, right, with an ROI balance that allows you to say, that kind of fits with where I want to go as a business, or it really doesn't.
Can you give me an example of the inhibiting and the types of pressures again?
Sure.
For example,
100%.
with this podcast, how would you apply the side technique for smaller companies that, for example, don't have the ammo? And then
So let's do it.
How would you do that?
Let's do it for your podcast. Are you ready?
All right. Yeah.
Shen, first we have to define
Excited.
Right. First we have to define what you want for your podcast. So you rub Matt's fuzzy bald head, the genie thing, and you formulate, and you got to remember, you got to formulate your wish really carefully. So who is going to be who do we want to reach?
Probably people my age.
Okay. So I want to read a couple other questions. We got to have some limitations. They need to be able to access the podcast, right? So they have to have some sort of smart device, some sort of internet, et cetera, right? Do
Hmm.
they have to speak English?
Yes.
Yeah, so they have to speak or at least understand English. Maybe they don't speak English, but they at
Yeah.
least understand what the hell you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So when people my age have access to the internet, want to understand, understand English, want to what? What's the reason they should listen to you?
Learn about entrepreneurship and how to improve their life.
Okay, great. So when young people who all of these things, who have an internet and blah, 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 want to improve their lives, they will listen to Shen's podcast as measured by what? How are we going to measure this outcome?
Viewership.
Ooh, so viewership's
Reach.
hard. Is it total number of people who started the episode, total number of people who finished the episode, total number of people who made it at least 25% in? Is it, if Matt listens to it twice, does that count as 2 or 1, right? So is the unit of analysis the person or is the unit of analysis the listens?
Right. Ugh.
I know. But this is, remember, you got to wish specifically on the genie because otherwise the genie will give you the thing that you don't want, right? It's that really specific genie wish that, so I can help you. I'm going to bet we care more about people than listens, right? So I probably, if Matt listens twice, I probably would only count that as 1, right? I don't care that a bunch of people, like if your mom listens to it 1,000,000 times, that's probably not your aim. You'd rather have 1,000,000 people. So this is a really, Shen, you laugh, but this is a really good trick.
Right.
Take things to the extreme. I can get 1 kid to listen to it 1,000,000 times, or I can get 1,000,000 kids to listen to it once. Which one would you rather have? 1,000,000 kids listening once. So that tells you the unit of analysis is probably not listens, it's probably people, right?
Yeah.
As measured by total number of people who have listened to at least 5 minutes of at least 1 episode of my podcast, right? So it's people, 5 minutes, 1 episode. If they listen to 4 minutes, it doesn't count, right? And they have to listen to at least 1. They don't have to have listened to them all, right? Could be different. You could say, total number of people who completed listening to at least 2, right? It's up to you to set those variables where you want, right?
2 separate.
It's your wish. Yeah, exactly. You could say 2 separate episodes. Total number of people who listen to at least 2 separate episodes all the way through, right?
Could you even say just listening to like 50% of the podcast,
100%.
50% of the content?
Again, and so the key there, Shen, is to make those hard trade-offs. Would you rather have 1,000 kids listen to the whole episode or 2,000 kids listen to half an episode?
I think people listen to the full episode.
So you'd rather have 1,000 people listen to the full episode than 2,000 people listen to half the episode. Because the key here is those are the same in terms of total number of minutes listened, right? If the episode is 10 minutes long and there's 1,000 kids, that's 10,000 minutes of listening. If it's 2,000 kids listening to 5 minutes, that's also 10,000 minutes of listening. So they're exactly the same in terms of minutes of listening. But you're saying, no, I'd rather they listen to the whole thing, right?
Actually, I changed my mind. I prefer the 2,000 different people. That's more reach.
Yeah, great. Okay. So all of those are the key to making a wish is there's no right or wrong wish. It's just specific or not specific. So all we're doing is trying to make sure we're making a specific wish. So when young people want to learn about entrepreneurship, they will listen to Shen's podcast as measured by total number of people who listen to at least 50% of 1 episode. Great. All right. So now we have our wish. So now we got to go look.
So that's strategy.
That's strategy. We've done with strategy.
Okay.
We've got our behavioral statement. Now we need to go do some research, right? Who's doing that today? Who never listens? Who sometimes listens? Who listens to more than 1 episode, right? Who listened to 1 episode and didn't come back, right? Who, used to listen a year ago faithfully to every episode, but dropped off? Who is a recent new listener? What's different between those people, right? I don't know the answer. You don't know the answer. We got to go do the work. So we'd go do that work. We're going to make it up. So we're going to say one of the inhibiting, how long is your average episode, Shen?
An hour.
Okay. They're an hour long. Okay. So if we have hour-long episodes, one of the inhibiting pressures is that an hour is a long time, right? So what could we do to change the inhibiting pressure that is an hour is a long time? It's a long time to ask Shen to somebody to sit down and listen to all of Shen's or a long thing.
Split it into 4 parts, 15 minutes each.
100%, right? So you could say, like, here's a natural break point. Like you could make them chapters. You could release those as individual podcasts. You could condense the podcast down to 15 minutes, right? So now we have two different interventions. One is still hour-long podcasts, but we're going to, every 15 minutes, we're going to say, you know, if you need to stop, here's a good place to stop and start next time. Okay, that's one. We're into design now, right? Because we had a pressure that we understood from insights, right?
Yeah.
Length is a problem. Now we're into design. So we come up with 3 different designs for reducing that pressure.
Wait, for the insight part,
Yep.
do you find as many insights as possible?
Yes.
Like, do you find all of them?
As many as you can.
All.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
You can't find all of them, right? You could spend infinite time finding out new things, right? You find out enough that you feel confident moving to the next stage and that have been cross-validated. So you want to see things that you can hear from people and are also true when you look in the data. You want things that from multiple perspectives seem to be true. The thing I always say about this is think about truth like a table, okay? If you put all of your legs at one corner of the table, is that a good steady table? No, right?
No.
Falls over. So if all I do is talk to people and interview people and they're all the same kind of person, let's say I only talk to the people who always listen to me, right? So I take the always group and I just talk to them. That's like putting everybody at one table. Like, well, what can I do to move the legs farther apart? Well, I can talk to people who have never listened to me. I can talk to people who used to listen to me, but don't anymore. So I can change the populations. And the other thing that I can do is I can change methodologies. So rather than talking to them, I can look at their data, right? Larger groups of people, things that I can extract stuff from. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So that's how we're going to get to our insights. We're making up an insight, you and I, that time is an inhibiting pressure. So we have 3 different potential designs, right? We have, we're going to split it up into 4 episodes of 15 minutes apiece, right?
Yeah.
We're going to leave it an hour-long episode, but we're going to, every 15 minutes, we're going to say, okay, that's the first part. Now's a good time to take a break if you need it, right? And then we're going to condense the actual whole episode down to 15 minutes. So instead of 4 15-minute parts, we're going to do the whole thing in 15 minutes.
Right.
Then you can try that. You can start, we now have designs. Now we got to evaluate. So you could try an experiment where you say, hey, this month I'm trying an experiment. I'm doing the X thing, right? 15 minutes. One of the things we talked about. And you can see which of those gets more traction, right? Do you get more people listening for at least 50% of the time, right? To a 15-minute complete episode, you know, something that's been broken up into 15-minute chunks, or something that just has announcements every 15 minutes versus your original thing. So you can test that out. That's the evaluation. So you and I could just go through this side method right now. And that's a thing you could actually try tomorrow, right? You could try a 15. You arbitrarily chose an hour. You said my episodes are going to be an hour long.
Yeah.
You could try 15-minute episodes, see what happens. Does it change the number of people who listen? Do you get a different kind of audience? Are people happier, right? You can experiment with all sorts of different things. And so that's the process. That's how we go through side for something as simple as your podcast. And, you know, you talked about young people improving their lives. I teach, you know, behavioral science, applied behavioral science in big companies, but there's no reason you can't use it in your personal life, right?
Yeah.
What do you want? You want to play basketball more often, right? Okay, great. Like, you know, when I want to get in shape, I will play basketball as measured by minutes of basketball played. Why do some days I play basketball, some days I don't. What changes? Like what's true on the days that I do, what's true on the days that I don't? Like what's the difference between those 2 days? What can I do about that, right? Like, can I get some new shoes? Can I pump up my ball better? Can I put it on my calendar? Can I block the time? Can I schedule a thing with a friend? Like, what are all the things that I can do to manipulate those pressures? And then let's try that, right? I'm going to get some new shoes. I'm going to try booking it with a friend. I'm going to try putting on a calculator. And then I'm going to keep the things that change my individual life, right? That's really the distinctive thing about science. There's very few things in life that work big and small, right? There's lots of things that work big, but they fall apart when you try and do them small. And there's lots of things that work small, but fall apart when you try and do them big. Science is one of the great things where you can zoom in or zoom out and the same process works, right? Because cause and effect is this beautiful thing that holds true across any kind of environment.
Right. So then it seems like it's similar to first principle thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so certainly the insights portion is trying to find those first principles. It's trying to find the things that actually directly affect behavior, right? So certainly that insights piece is about trying to tease out those first principles. The design piece is more about like, okay, given those first principles, what do I do about it? And the thing that the first principles thinking is often missing is one of the things that the over rotations that happens in first principles thinking is, well, because I know these first principles, I can assume this thing will be true. That works in math, right? If you know how geometry works and then you do a problem, you will always come out with the same answer because the world of math is static. So we wouldn't need the E if we were just talking math. The problem is the world is in fact not static. It's massively complicated. Humans are variable. And so because of all this variance, right, 1 + 1 might not equal exactly 2 in every circumstance, everywhere with every person, then I have to evaluate, right? I have to say, I think something works this way, and therefore this thing should work. I better find out, right? A lot of first principles thinking has led people to overconfidence about, well, I know how this thing works, so I don't have to test it because I know it will work. The number of times entrepreneurs have come to me and said, I know this will work. And I say, what evidence do you have it'll work? And they say, I know it will work. Based on what? Based on what evidence do you know this thing will work? You're 100% confident it'll work, and yet you have no evidence for that belief. That's the place where we get into some trouble. Start to gather evidence, right? So when I ask startups to pitch me, I want to know. I want to see evidence of this same process. What behaviors are they monetizing? Do they know what they're monetizing? Do they know what they actually want people to do? What's their key insight about why people why people would want to do that and why they aren't already doing it? How have they tested some things to get to a place where they have some confidence that their thing is worth scaling? Because usually when you come to somebody like me and you want entrepreneurial funding, that's about scaling something, right? You have a belief and you have some evidence that that belief is true, and it's really about scaling that thing up. Because you don't need money to test things. Generally, you need money to scale things. And so, scaling money is the place where, I want some evidence.
On the topic of startups, I've actually been really interested in that kind of thing. And one of the things that's always been stressed is building a good product. If your product is good, people will come. Then, for example, with this podcast, I want to improve the content. How could I use the behavioral science to improve the content? Because I've been thinking for a couple days of how I can give more, like provide more value, but I haven't come up with a solid solution yet.
Yeah, I mean, so even the fact, so you just demonstrated a human bias. So we have this bias, which is if I want to get people to do something more, I need to increase promoting pressure, right? If I want people to do something more, I got to make it more rewarding. And if I want people to do something less, by the way, I think about punishment, right? How do I, what that implies is actually, think about Uber. Uber didn't make going around in the back of anybody's car any more attractive than it ever was. They just made it easier to do, right? They focused on lowering inhibiting pressures. So you just said, well, what can I do to make my content more valuable? How can I make my content more attractive? That's promoting pressure. What I would challenge you with is, how can you make your content easier? Right? So
in terms of easier to understand and access?
Easier to understand and access and learn from, right? So if your goal from this content is for people to listen and learn and do something, you could try and make it more attractive. You could say, how do I get better content, better people, blah, 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 blah. But you could also try to just make it easier. Could you give people the bullet points version, right? Is there a study guide? Is there a recommended next step? Here are the 3 things you should do because you listen to this podcast, right? So I just spent an hour talking to Matt Wallaert. Here are the 3 things you should do as soon as you get done listening to this podcast. You should go, write a behavioral statement for something you want to change. You should, think about why you do and don't do it. And you should try an experiment to see if you can change your own behavior, right? If you think about a teacher, right? We're all teaching
Yeah.
the same thing. Think about the high school level teachers. It's not like there's new history to teach. I'm teaching exactly the same history as every other teacher is teaching, hopefully, right? What changes is what I do to make it easier for you to learn that, right? That's what a teacher does, right? They structure content in such a way that it's easy to learn rather than trying to make the content itself more attractive. Although at times they also are responsible for the promoting pressure side. How do I get you to want to learn this thing? But assuming that you want to learn it, my job is to make it easier for you to learn.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
But
That
that's
seems like a much easier way.
But that's what behavioral science does for you, right? Even
Right.
just the simple act of drawing an up arrow and a down arrow and saying, hey, what are all the things I can do to get, people to want to listen to it? But what are all the things that I can do to make it easier to listen to? That's key.
Right. So how can I just make it easier for someone to understand the content? Oh. Oh, that opens a lot of doors.
It really does, right?
Ah,
Can you add a little section at the
yeah.
beginning where you tell people,
Yeah.
or a section at the end where you tell people the takeaways, or a section at the beginning where you introduce it in a certain way, or like,
Yeah.
hey, be listening for, my favorite moments were at minute 8, 32, and 49, right? Are like
Right.
a couple of really good clips that I found. Like that kind of stuff can make it easier for people to learn. It doesn't make your content more attractive. It just makes it easier to do. And that, I think, is a key flip.
I could almost at the start tell them what gets talked about and then give them timestamps to skip through if they want to go to those things.
So timestamps are a wonderful example of reducing inhibiting pressure. They don't make the content any more attractive. It's exactly the same content. They just make the content easier to access, right?
Right.
So think about, I had to replace the cabin air filter. I have a Mazda 3. I had to replace the cabin air filter in my Mazda 3 today. The YouTube, and this is a relatively recent feature over the history of YouTube. It had a chapter, which was like how to find where the damn thing is, how to replace it, right? And like finishing steps, like how to clean it up. I already knew where the thing was. I already knew how to replace it. I just needed to know how to put it all back. So I could just skip the first 2/3 of the video and go back to the like, how do I get this thing to go back together again bit? Because that's the only part I needed. If you didn't have chapters, I couldn't do that. I'm like skipping around in the middle trying to figure out where the fuck he is and So it's that kind of reduction of inhibiting pressure because we have these biases. And the same thing, by the way, implies, Shen, on the other side. Often we're trying to get people not to do something. I don't want kids to bully each other. I don't want this person to be mean. I don't want, I don't want to get people to eat junk food. There's tons of other things I'm trying to get people to stop. And a lot of times we think we'll punish people for that. So I don't want kids to bully each other. I'm going to stop this kid from bullying a kid where when he bullies another kid, I'm going to punish him. He has to sit out. Okay. But what could you do on the promoting pressure side? Why was this kid bullying the kid in the first place, right? What was the promoting pressure? He didn't do it randomly, right? There's a reason that kid did that. There's a promoting pressure, right? And so, if the reason that this kid was bullying another kid is because they felt really deeply insecure about themselves, could I tackle that insecurity so that I didn't have to punish them later, right? I didn't have to rely on inhibiting pressure, but instead, think about crime, right? We can turn up the volume on punishing criminals. But if we don't understand why people commit crimes in the first place, we're not going to win, right? Like you can make the punishments infinitely high and people will still commit crimes because, my need and not my will consents, right? Like, if I'm starving, I'm going to steal bread. Doesn't matter how much the punishment for stealing bread is going to be if I'm starving, right? If we can reduce the promoting pressure that is starving, right? It's a good way to end crime. So it works in both ways.
That's almost like you can apply it for anything. Like if you want to lose weight, instead of forcing yourself to eat healthy, find a way to, is it promote eating healthy or promote not wanting to eat the bad food or making it harder to access?
Both, right? So often you have competing behaviors. So I have junk food, eating healthy food. Each has its own set of pressures. Healthy food has a promoting pressure, inhibiting pressure. Junk food has a promoting pressure, inhibiting pressure, right? And a lot of times what we'll do is pit the promoting pressures against each other. I have to make I have to make healthy food taste better than junk food. Not really, right? If I make healthy food like very available and unhealthy food very unavailable, that will change my behavior. I'll give you a great example from my house, right? The apples are out in a bowl on the counter. Why? Because that way, when I'm hungry, I walk by and I snag an apple and I eat this lovely apple. The chips are on a high shelf so that it's a pain in the ass and I have to go over this other thing and I have to get up on the shelf and I have to get the fucking things. Now, does that mean I never eat chips? Of course not, right? Of course, sometimes I put in the effort to go get the chips when I want the chips, but it just makes it slightly harder and it makes those apples slightly easier. And that slightly harder and slightly easier balance is enough to change my behavior some of the time.
Right. Oh, that's a new way of thinking about things. Wow. Wow, that was eye-opening.
Audience, you can't see it right now, but Shen's brain is coming out his nose. He's like, oh my God.
So it almost ties back to like how companies like Amazon and all these big companies, they make it so everything uses less clicks.
100%.
Everything is more accessible.
Amazon patented the one-click buy because they didn't want anybody else to be able to use it, right? So they patented and aggressively sued people to protect the idea that you could hit a button and buy something in one click, right? You look at Amazon, it is not a pretty site. There's a million options on the screen and they're not very attractive looking and they're confusing and it's hard to see stuff. Like, it's not, the promoting pressures are not high. You compare that to something like Anthropology, right? Everything on their website is going to be beautiful and it's going to be beautiful, high res pictures and they're going to be really well presented and it's going to be gorgeous. It's a gorgeous experience, right?
Right.
Amazon said, hey, we're going to win by reducing inhibiting pressure. We're going to make it so easy to buy shit, right? And it's going to show up at your door in overnight and it's going to be super quick shipping and shipping is going to be free and it's going to be all one bundled price and it's blah, 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 blah. We're going to make it as easy as humanly possible. Anthropology said, you're going to have to wait a week and we're going to charge you for shipping separately, but shit is going to be super beautiful, right? Those are two really opposite strategies for how you run a business. And the right answer is push through those extremes, right? That's, there's a lot of money to be made in startups in automation. Shit that Shen doesn't really care about, right?
Like software.
Yeah, it's not core to your identity. Uber is not core to your identity. It's just stupidly convenient, right? I just take something that you don't want to have to think about, right? Going from point A to point B and just make it crazy easy to do, right? So you never have to think about how you're going to get somebody again. Shen, you're a young person. But when I was your age, you had to think really hard about how you were going to get somewhere, right? Like there was a lot of planning that went into like, if I want to go see my friend Shen, there was a lot of planning that like, is his mom picking, who's picking up, who's dropping off? Like, what are the timing? How do we set expectations? Now it's like, I know I'm going to be able to get there because I know there's an Uber that will take me there and I know there's an Uber that will take me back, right? I don't have to think about any of those things. So that's automation. Then the other place where there's a lot of money is curation. I care a lot about cars. Actually, getting from point A to point B is really interesting to me. I love cars. Let me go really deep on cars. Let me go really deep on how I go from point A to point B. And what it turns out is there's not a lot of people in the middle. Either you care or you don't care. You either care a lot or you don't care at all, right? There's not many things where people care a little. And so what that means is there's two really great kinds of startups. Things for people who don't care, Uber, and things for people who care a lot, Car and Driver Magazine, right? Like everything in between doesn't fucking matter.
Right. I think that's like a tip for people starting a business. They should either pick being super accessible or the complete opposite, which is just super good process.
Yep. So super high quality, right? So I often sort of, accessibility versus quality. Now, ideally, you can be high quality and high accessibility, and there are things that are that way. But if you have to choose in your limited resources world, go extreme one end, extreme the other end. What I often say is, we talk in science about satisfaction and maximization, right? So satisficing is good enough. Anything above this point is good enough, right? Maximizing is I want the absolute best. So for the things you really care about, like basketball, I want the absolute best basketball shoes I can get, and I will try on 100 pairs, and I will play test them on the court, and I'll do all sorts of things to make sure I get the absolute best for the thing that I care about.
Right.
I don't care at all about what shirt I'm wearing today, right? And so as long as it is reasonably comfy, it can't be uncomfortable, right? It can't be negative. But as soon as it's good enough, anything that's good, I don't care if it's blue or white, right? I don't care about any of these other features as long as it's good enough. And so what you want to do when you're shaping a business is you want to say, I'm going to find the things that good enough, right? Uber has to be cheap enough, have good enough drivers, has to be good enough experience. And then I'm going to maximize for how quickly I can get people from point A to point B, right? So I'm going to be good enough on all the other things, and I'm going to find one thing that I'm going to be the best I can possibly be. Think of it like math, right? If I have an equation and I put a bunch of variables over here on one side, I can't solve for that. Algebra doesn't work that way, right? It doesn't like floating variables. But if I say, hey, there's one thing that matters and I'm going to put it over here, and then there's a bunch of other things that have to be good enough, and I'll put them over here, that makes the process of building a business a lot easier. So how cheap does something have to be? How convenient does it have to be? I'm going to be good enough on those, and then I'm going to maximize on something else, right? The highest quality that's not more than $10 and doesn't take more than 2 days to get, right? I'm maximizing quality. But I could say something that's good enough quality, less than $10, and then I want it as fast as humanly possible. That's just taking one of the variables and swapping it, right? I could say something different. I could say good enough quality, we'll get here in 2 days, as cheap as possible. That's a lot of what Amazon does, right? A lot of what Amazon shopping is you know it's going to get there within 1 or 2 days if you're on Prime. It's of good enough quality, right? It's got enough reviews that it's probably okay. What is the cheapest thing, right? I want the cheapest thing.
So it's almost like the three things. It's like the three things, and you only need one of them to be the best.
The best, that's right.
Essentially, not all three.
That's right. I just have to be good enough on the other ones, right? I have to be good enough, and then I really have to go as far as I can. And that really aligns your team. Hey, we have to be good enough on A and good enough on B, and all of our resources are going to be on making C as good as humanly possible, right? The best it can possibly be.
Right. You're a successful person, and before you said that you drove a Mazda, right?
I do. Because
why is that?
It's related back to you're like, why the fuck don't I drive a Maserati? It's related to the thing we just said. I don't give a shit about that. I don't care about a car. Car's not where I would have spend my money, right? Like I have a set of things I care about, and I spend a lot of money on those things, and then I just automate everything else. Clothes is a really great example. Clothes are not interesting to me. I need to have good enough clothes, but they're not a place that, so I literally, when I was 26, 27, something like that, I ordered a bunch of shirts off eBay, just used shirts off eBay. And then I tried them on until I found a shirt that fit, that was cheap and that I could get off the rack, which happened to be a Nordstrom trim fit 15, 34, 35 shirt. Great. Now I don't have to think about that anymore. I literally have a script. It just buys them and then sends them to me, right? So periodically new shirts arrive. They're exactly like my old shirts. I cycle out the shirts and I never have to think about that again, right? This jacket is a John Varvatos 40R blazer. How do I know? Because every jacket I own is a John Varvatos 40R blazer, right? I don't think about it. They just, that's it. I don't think about it. Why? Because I just don't give a shit, right? That's the thing. It has to be good enough, right? I have to satisfy. It can't be, it can't be terrible fitting. I can't look like a clown, right? It can't be terrible quality that I don't want to wear. That's uncomfortable. So it has to be good enough.
Right.
But anything above good enough, I don't care, right? It's not important.
That now that I think of it, it's all the biggest companies in the world. They actually just excel at one thing. Like for eBay, it's the price, right?
Yep.
eBay's cheaper.
It's the cheapest possible version of a thing
and
that I can
Walmart
get.
is the price. Oh, that's a new way of looking at it. Wow.
But a lot of things aren't price. Nike is quality, right?
Yeah.
Anthropology is quality, right? I'm not going to
like Rolex and stuff is quality.
That's quality, right? I'm going to maximize quality, right? And there are lots of different characteristics on which we could take something that you care about. I don't know, the microphone you're using. There are lots of different characteristics of a microphone that you might decide that you were going to make your thing, right?
Right.
It isn't, I'm not trying to say one of those is better to maximize than another. I'm just saying pick one, right? Be the best sounding microphone at a particular, I am the best sounding microphone,
Price.
less than $50.
Yeah.
Right? Satisficing on price. I'm not the cheapest microphone, right? I'm not $2. I'm 50 or less, and the best you can get for 50 or less.
Right. Wait, before you said that there was you didn't spend money on clothes and cars. What do you spend money on? Like what is your
So there are a couple of things I tend, well, I mean, some of them are just related to my identity. So I am willing to spend money on things that I use a lot. So a good phone, a good computer, things that, I spend all my day on the phone or computer. I want things that really work, right? So those are places where good matters. Experiences, right? Experiences are these lovely priceless things, and it's worth spending money on having experiences. I also just, I didn't grow up with money. And so when you don't grow up with money, your bar for a lot of these things is quite a bit lower. I spend a lot of money on my kid, right? I want to try and give him as many experiences as I can, as broad a range of experiences as I can, make sure that he gets the education and the other things that he needs to be his best self. I spend time or money on people, right? Seeing my parents, flying places, doing whatever I need to do to see my co-parent and my romantic partner and all the people that are in my life. That's a place to spend money for me. Lots of charities and supporting social causes that I care about, because I want I want a world that isn't terrible, right? I want a world that is good and fair and kind and all of those things. But one of the secrets of being an entrepreneur is just keeping your burn low, right? Keeping your, I watched an interview with a professional football coach the other day, and he was the people that were interviewing, it was like a podcast of like former players and him. And he was talking about, seeking comfort. And he said, y'all are seeking comfort, right? You want your fancy car, you want your mansion, etc. And he said, look, I have a nice house too, but I have a nice house for my wife and my kids, right? I carefully in my life make sure that I don't seek too much comfort. And I kind of agree with the guy, right? I am very careful about not seeking too much comfort. For years at Microsoft, Google has free lunch. They're notorious for having these beautiful, wonderfully cooked, beautiful free lunches. Because Google has this idea that, as a Google employee, you shouldn't have to think about these lifestyle things. And so Microsoft engineers for many years would be like, oh, we want free lunch too. We want free lunches. And I wrote a paper internally that was very controversial where I said, we have to be really careful about these kinds of things, because we are never going to solve payments here if we get everything for free. Because if we don't experience the pain that is payment, we're not aware of that problem when we don't solve it, right? This is a problem with tech in general, right? If the average tech person makes $200,000 a year and doesn't experience any of the problems that the rest of the world, who, by the way, the median household income is like 50, 60 grand. If you don't experience those people's problems, you're never going to solve things for those people, right? Because you don't perceive them as problems. You don't have to think about how the hell you pack lunch because somebody fucking gives you lunch, right? If we're Microsoft and we want to solve the problems of the world, we have to experience the problems of the world, right? And that's not universally true. I'm not saying that we shouldn't ever, there can be some comforts like getting lunch. I'm sensitive to what Google said. Hey, we don't want people distracted by thinking about lunch. But I think that can be taken too far. If people don't have to think about anything, they will solve nothing, right? If they experience no discomfort, they will not solve for discomfort. And if the discomforts that they do experience are so fucking abstract and so unique to people who have $200,000 or more, they won't solve anything for the vast majority of people who actually have problems.
Right. You worked at Microsoft, right?
I did. Yeah.
What was it like? Because I remember when I was young, my mom was like, please study hard, work at Google, because they have places where you can sleep and get free food and make a lot of money.
It was great. I really enjoyed Microsoft. I left only because I was moving. If I had an opportunity to go back, I'd go back again. All of my engagements with Satya have been positive and well-intentioned. And even when he does things that I don't agree with, I think, he's a positive, well-intentioned leader. So yeah, I'd go back to Microsoft. I really enjoyed the culture and the people.
Did you mean the CEO?
Yeah, Satya Nadella, who's
You met
the
him?
current CEO. Yeah. He's around campus, so I
Wow.
meet him all the time.
What is he like?
He's relatively soft-spoken. He's pretty high energy. He asks really good questions. I think in my experience with CEOs, good CEOs, one of the defining characteristics is really that they ask really strong questions, right? Interrogative questions. They want to know things. There's this psych scale I love called the need for cognition scale. And the reason I love it is because with a lot of psych scales, it feels like, or personality surveys, it feels like the right answers are obvious, right? Like it's better to say this than it is to say that. One of the things I like about need for cognition is it's not at all obvious. So there are questions like, I like everything in my life to be a puzzle. Well, not everybody would agree with that. Not everybody in the world would say, you know what I want to do is solve puzzles all day. For some people, that sounds exhausting, right? That sounds terrible.
Right.
One of the things that I found, however, is one of the characteristics of really highly effective CEOs tends to be a high need for cognition. They like knowing, they like understanding, they are curious about the puzzles of the world, and they're not seeking comfort, right? They're not seeking sort of like, I don't want to have any problems anymore. They want problems because problems are fun and problems are interesting, and they find problems intrinsically rewarding. And so they look for a problematic world. They look for a world. They look for where there are holes in the universe, right? And so, go ahead.
Do you think that these characteristics can be trained, or they're born with it?
The combination, look, let's talk about absolute truth and functional truth. So the absolute truth is people come into the world with a personality, right?
Right.
My parents happened to be down this weekend. I was talking to my parents. My brother and I are only 18 months apart, right? So we're very close in age. We could, my mom was like, from the moment you were born, you were different than your brother, right? And my brother and I are very different. We're very similar in some ways, but like, we're only 18 months apart. So we were raised in virtually identical environments, right? We have exactly the same parents, like virtually identical experiences. And yet we turn out really differently. Personality obviously matters. Yeah. That's the absolute truth. The functional truth is most people can do most things, right? Most people can do most things. And so can you train yourself to be fascinated by puzzles? Absolutely. Do some of us come into the world more fascinated by puzzles? Yes, right? But from the functional perspective, from the way that you and I should interact with the world, everybody can do pretty much everything given proper support. And so, yeah, absolutely. People can learn to fall in love with puzzles.
So what are like the main characteristics that people should have if they want to be a good leader or CEO?
I don't think there's...
Like, what are the most important?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to reject the notion that there's one good kind of CEO or one good kind of leader. So I have a degree in psych, degree in education. And one of the things that really stood out to me as a teacher when I was doing my student teaching was the kids that respond. There's a guy across the hall, been a teacher a really long time. And the kids that really learned from him weren't very good at learning from me. And the kids that really learned from me weren't very good at learning from him. Was one of us a better or worse teacher? No, we just taught in a way that worked for some kids and didn't work for other kids. And he taught for and so the overlapping of our circles got every kid, right? Because the kids that liked me didn't like him, and the kids that liked him didn't like me, right? So between the two of us, we got everybody, right?
Right.
I think leadership is like that. Not everybody is going to respond to the same leader, right? For a variety of reasons, identity, style, business, pressures, all sorts of different things. There's lots of reasons why somebody might not be the right leader for you, right? I as a psychologist, I'm often a fan of like 2x2 matrices. Everything in social psychology is 2x2, right? So I used to talk about genius, idiot, awesome asshole, right? Awesome asshole.
Right.
So if someone is an idiot and an asshole, it's really easy to just say, I don't want to engage with that person at all, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so similarly, if someone is an awesome genius, it's really easy to be like, yeah, I want to spend all my time around awesome geniuses. The hard part are the
Right.
other two. What do you do with genius assholes, right? And awesome idiots, right? So what I always said was, for genius assholes, I just pass them off to someone else. Because what I've learned in my life is, just because I think you're an asshole doesn't mean someone else thinks you're an asshole, right? Whatever you're doing might rub me wrong, but it doesn't rub everybody wrong, right? There are
Right.
people who I hate that people I love, right? And I can't understand it. I'm like, I don't know what you see in that person, but they love them, right? And it works for
Right.
them. And so if someone, if someone is an asshole, you pass them off to someone else, help them find someone who doesn't think they're an asshole. On the idiot side, I think it's about giving them, how can you help them develop? You're so awesome. Let me give you some homework that you can work on so that you can come back better than you were before and we can continue to be involved, right? You give people the ability to up level. That's where you want to invest your resources. We want to invest in people who don't have the skills that we need them to have today, but have the drive and the motivation and the awesomeness that we enjoy and like working with to kind of get them there. And what I found in life is knowing and not knowing is a little bit more, it's either true or not true, right? It's a sort of concrete.
Right.
Asshole, awesome. It's very personal. It's a very personal reaction. And so if I think, it's hard to go to someone else, very rarely do I and someone else agree on the genius idiot part of someone, right? We often have agreement about the genius idiot part of someone, but we don't always agree about the asshole awesome part of someone. And so that stochastic nature suggests that we should be passing those people on. That's what diversity is about. Not everybody has to be for everybody. That's okay.
Right.
And leaders are that way. So, what do I think leaders should focus on? I think leaders should focus on the things that no one can argue with, right? No one would argue that a disrespectful leader is better. So that's a place to invest some real time and energy, is to be respectful, because that's something everybody wants. So when you're a leader, I think the thing to invest in is the skills that appeal to everybody. And then let your natural skills help people sort into who specifically wants to work with you. So do things that are good, that nobody would argue that that's bad, right? And then let individual difference determine the rest. Because I can tell you right now, I'm not the leader for everybody, right?
What about things like the ability to handle pressure and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, when we say the ability to handle pressure, what is it? See, this is like, we're back to the very specific genie wishing, right? Some people, handling pressure means showing it, right? Some people want to feel somebody. Some people want to follow a leader who is showing how the pressure is affecting them, right? Showing that emotionality,
Really?
showing that, yeah, absolutely. They want somebody who's in the trenches with them, who's sweating as hard as they're sweating, right? Who really want that. Some people want a leader who's very aloof, who, looks fucking nerves of steel, and, they draw calmness from that person's calmness. Some people want somebody who's empathetic, who's like them, and some people want somebody who's very different than them and pulls them towards that. That's an individual difference. It's different for different people, right?
Right.
And so, I don't think there's I think that there's always this striving for universalist things about leadership. I think there's very few universals, and the universals are the place to, like, psychological safety is a great example. Everybody performs better when they're in a psychologically safe environment. As a leader, figuring out how to create a bubble of psychological safety, an aura of psychological safety around you, that's going to be good for everybody. Doesn't matter if they're awesome idiots or genius assholes, doesn't matter. That's good for everybody. So those are the places to invest.
So there's this stigma around psychology that people think it's a useless major or it's useless. And I've seen that it is more useful than I thought, but there are some things that I don't understand. Like, how can you study psychology when, for example, you can have a father who's alcoholic and one kid could become an alcoholic because of his father and the other might not drink alcohol at all because of his father? How do you study that?
Well, but here's the thing. The reason, at least my branch of psychology, let's talk about social psychology, not clinical psychology, right? So the changing of people, this is one of the fundamental mistakes that people make, is they think of this as deterministic, right? So deterministic means, when always A and always B, therefore always C, right? That's not how it works, right? Social psychology is probabilistic. So, as an example, it is probabilistically true that if one or both of your parents is an alcoholic, you are more likely to become an alcoholic. That is probabilistically true.
Right.
It's not deterministically true. Everyone who has an alcoholic parent becomes an alcoholic. That's determinism.
Right.
It's probabilism, right? In general, people who have alcoholic parents are more likely, and we can capture how likely they are. There's actually a number associated with it. We can
Matt, sorry to stop you there.
Yep.
But do you have your camera on?
Yes. And I can see
okay.
and I can see myself.
Oh, okay. I can't see you.
You can't see
me? But never
me?
mind. Keep on going.
I
Sorry.
look hideous. No. Let's see here. If I do this and then I do this, did I come back?
No, just keep going. Just keep going. It'll save on your.
It doesn't matter. Yeah. I'm ugly. So this is one of the problems that people who think of psychology as useless typically reference deterministic examples. They say, well, because A plus B doesn't always equal C, I'm uninterested. And
right.
But the thing is, like, if I'm running a business, I don't need A plus B to always equal C. I just need A and B to equal C in predictable ways. Right? This is Dan Ariely's predictably irrational, right? People are predictable across large numbers. And so I can create business value out of that predictability. You know, if you think of it like a curve of probability, I can create business value by bending that curve, right? So the first way that people created business value was by predicting that curve. Think insurance, right? So the first epoch of insurance is Shen is a farmer, Matt is a farmer. Yep. We agree to pool some of our money so that if one of us has a bad crop, we'll have some money to fall back on. That's basic insurance, pooled risk. In the second generation of insurance, we figure out Shen is way better at this than Matt is, right?
Right.
So Shen only has to give a little bit of his crops and Matt has to give a lot of his crops because Matt is really bad at this, right? Mm-hmm. That's when we start doing sort of we start predicting that risk curve. We do actuarial risk, right? So we go from static risk to actuarial risk, where we can take variables into account. The third generation of insurance, and this is where we are today, is about bending that curve. We say, we already got all the money we can get from the fact that Shen is a better farmer than Matt. How can we make Matt a better farmer? Right? Now we're in the like bending the curve thing. And so if you look across industries, there's this predictable movement where people go from, where it goes from sort of like flat pooling to like understanding the underlying thing to actually doing something about it, right? And you know, more mature industries are much better at getting to the wanting to do a thing.
Right. Are you familiar with psychotherapy?
Of course. My co-parent is a DBT psychologist. My romantic partner is a child and family therapist. So yes, I'm very familiar. Like, oh, wow. I'm surrounded by therapists.
What is that like? Do they just like analyze you randomly?
No, I mean, I think this is a stereotype.
This is why you're doing this.
I think this is a stereotype that people have of psychologists, that they're like walking around and, you know, analyzing everybody all the time. That's what they do at work. They don't want to come home and do that shit. Right? That is not generally something that I find a lot of.
What do you think are some interesting things that if I had an opportunity to speak to a psychotherapist, I should talk about or learn about?
That's an interesting question. You know, I think a lot of so there's been a movement towards evidence-based therapy, and a lot of the evidence-based therapies that work are very skills-based. So I think, what skills do you teach people is a great question to ask a psychotherapist. What skills do you think everybody should learn? So I'll give you a great example from DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. One of the things that's often talked about is validation. So if Shen, if you say my arm hurts, right?
Yeah.
Or let's see if I can think of a good example. See, this is why I got to talk to psychotherapists and not me. If I poke you in the arm and you say, ow, that really hurt, but it was kind of a soft poke. Mm-hmm. I could argue with you about whether or not it hurt, right? About whether or not I agree it hurt. Validation is just saying, oh, I understand that hurt you, right? It's not agreeing. It's not saying, I agree that should hurt. It's saying, you feel hurt, and therefore that's a valid feeling, hence validation, right? Whatever you're feeling is
Right.
valid because you're obviously feeling it, right? So it's not about right or
Mm-hmm.
wrong. It's moving to this framing of like, and that has really helped me be, I think, a better partner in the world at work and to my son and a better romantic partner, is to recognize that like, I don't have to agree with how someone's feeling. I just have to recognize that they are in fact feeling that way, right? And validate,
Right.
yeah, I get that you're feeling that way. It's not, I'm not saying I would feel that way. I'm not saying like, I agree or not. I'm just saying that's a reasonable way to feel because I think you're reasonable and you feel it. Therefore, it's a reasonable way to feel by definition.
Right.
It's such a small change, but it's so valuable, and it will change, how you communicate with people across a number of different circumstances. And so it's stuff like that's what I get from psychotherapy is the skills things that they teach everybody to do, right?
Right. But I want to be respectful of your time, so I have one more
Oh,
question.
sure.
If I want to become successful with people my age who are younger, what do you think we should do? What advice would you have?
Figure out what success means to you. The biggest problem with saying something like, I want to be successful, is that a lot of people haven't really thought critically about what success means to them, right? If we go back to the side, all the way back to the side message, right? Strategy, insights, design,
Yeah.
evaluation. You can't do any of the other things if you don't know where you want to go, right?
Right.
There's this Mary Poppins, right? Well begun is half done. I will tell you that a good behavioral statement, understanding what it really means, right? What it really means to be successful for you is the best way to get there. It is the most important thing that you can do.
Right.
And running the experiments that help you figure that out, right? A lot of people say, I want to make a lot of money, but when they make a lot of money, they turn out to be not all that happy, right? With their lives.
Right.
It's worth figuring out before you figure out how to go make a lot of money, whether money actually matters that much to you and how much money actually matters to you, right? How much money tends to make a difference for you, right? And there's no magic rule. It's not like $89. $89 is exactly the amount of money that makes you happy. It's not one thing that generalizes across everybody. You have to find your individual thresholds for those things. And you have to be very wary of a world that tries to tell you what success is, right? We talk about toxic masculinity that says, hey, if you have sex with tons of women, you'll feel happy. And yet there are men out there who have sex with tons of women are miserable, right? Miserable.
Yeah.
So you have to be really careful when people tell you what should make you happy, and you need to figure out what really does for yourself. And if there's anything that I think people fundamentally get wrong, it's feeling like the thing that makes you happy is not okay. The shame people feel about whatever makes them happy, right?
Right.
I will leave you on this example. So there was a sex columnist, Dan Savage, who used to, it was like people would write in questions and he would answer. And he was notorious because he was writing in an era where, homosexuality was becoming a thing that was becoming normalized in America and those sorts of things, right? And he had this wonderful non-judgmental way of answering things. And so somebody wrote in and said, to me, it is sexually attractive. And I'm going to screw this up because I can't remember which direction it was. But he says, it's sexually attractive to me when I suck the snot out of my partner's nose. That really turns me on. And what I loved is that Dan Savage didn't blink a fucking eye. He just said, oh yeah, that makes sense. So here's the term for that. And so you want to find a woman who likes getting sucked snot from her nose. And here's the term for that. And there are people who like that. It was such a normalizing moment. He said, he didn't say, hey, that's so fucking weird. And he didn't, laugh and he didn't do anything. He just said, yeah, that's totally normal. Like, here's the kind of person that you're looking for who's going to enjoy this thing with you. Hopefully you find that person. Good luck. Right? That's what you want, right? You need to figure out in life, not what other people tell you what but actually help you be happy. And it could be as weird as it fucking is. Maybe it's sucking snot from some woman's nose. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right? Who knows?
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah. One of the things that I've started realizing lately, and I've been telling all my friends, is that you have to have a goal. Like, you need to figure out what your goal is. Because from this talk, I realized that you can apply the side strategy to your whole life and then apply the side strategy to subparts of that life.
Mhm.
Like if you have a big goal, you find out the little steps you need to take along the way and apply it to each of those steps. And I think if someone doesn't have a goal, it leads them to not doing anything. And I believe that when a person doesn't do anything or isn't productive, that's when things like anxiety and depression come along.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you believe in, but
I mean, we have lots of evidence of it. Humans want to feel effective. They want to feel like they're doing meaningful stuff. And so when you have very vague goals, like I
Yeah.
want to be famous, what the fuck does famous mean? Right? Like,
Yeah.
go back to that behavioral statement. What do you mean? Do you want 1,000 people to listen to 1 minute of an episode,
Right.
or one person to listen to 1,000 minutes of
Yeah.
an episode? What does fame mean to you? Right? Is it
Yeah.
everybody knowing you? Is it some people knowing you? What kind of people? What do they know you for? Right? It's that level of specificity. That's what I mean. It's back to the, like, you know, finding out that you like sucking snot from a nose. Like, whatever it is for you, find it, right? Find it and run experiments and experiments and experiments until you find it, and be willing to experiment on your own life, right? Getting there is actually a lot easier than finding the things that actually make you happy.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that has become a problem nowadays is that because of social media, everyone is looking at the same thing all the time. So everyone basically thinks the same. So when I ask someone, at least in high school, what do you want to do? And they say, oh, yeah, I know what I want to do. And then they say, I want to be rich. And then I ask them, okay, I don't even ask them what that means, but I ask them, how do you want to get there? And they're absolutely blank. And I think if someone wants to become successful, they need to have a goal and then need to figure out the steps to that goal. It won't be exactly the same, but you just need to iterate.
Yeah. I mean, I think you should try asking them what rich means to them. What do you think? What is rich for you?
Yeah.
Why'd you pick that number? Why this number and not that number? Right? Like, what would be different about this versus that? Like, it's starting to push, right? It's that desire. That's the advice I have for being successful. It's that desire to push on things, to really find out, to get to the specific and not be okay with the general, right? Not be okay with the inspecific.
Right.
I do unfortunately have to go because I'm
Yeah.
30 minutes over and I got to run to my next thing.
Yeah.
But this was super fun. Hopefully it's helpful. Let me know when it comes out.
Yeah.
I'll push it out over all the things. And I appreciate you taking
Yeah.
some time with me, Shen.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
All right, man. Go easy.